The wind, a malevolent sculptor, carved frigid spirals through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that lined the road to Blackwood. It plucked at the tattered cloaks of the few souls brave or foolish enough to venture forth on such a day, and it sang a dirge through the eaves of the half-timbered houses, huddled together like frightened sheep against the encroaching gloom. The sky, a bruised purple, bled into the gray stone of the distant cathedral, its twin spires piercing the low-hanging clouds like the fangs of some monstrous, sleeping beast. Mud, thick and treacherous, sucked at the boots of every passer-by, a cruel companion to the incessant drizzle that had plagued the town of Oakhaven for weeks, transforming its cobbled lanes into slick, treacherous rivers. The year was 1487, and a profound chill, far deeper than that of winter's embrace, had settled over the land. Elias Thorne, a man whose presence was as unsettling as a forgotten dream, moved through the sodden streets with a quiet dignity that belied the weariness etched into his angular face. His cloak, once a rich, deep blue, was now faded and threadbare, its hood drawn low, shadowing eyes that held the haunted depths of a moonless night. He was a stranger, an interloper, and in Oakhaven, where generations had lived and died within the same narrow confines, a stranger was often synonymous with a threat. His height, unusual for the common folk, and the precise, almost deliberate way he placed each foot, drew furtive glances from beneath heavy brows. They saw his well-kept hands, too clean for a laborer, too strong for a mere scribe, and suspicion bloomed in their hearts like a noxious weed. He carried no sword, no obvious implements of trade, only a worn leather satchel clutched tightly in one hand, hinting at secrets and knowledge not readily shared. Oakhaven was a town accustomed to hardship. The last harvest had been meager, the winter sickness had claimed too many of the young and the old, and the pronouncements from the bishopric in the distant city of Veritas had grown increasingly severe, threatening excommunication for the slightest deviation from the rigid doctrines of the Holy Mother Church. Fear, a cunning artisan, had begun to sculpt the townsfolk, twisting their faces into masks of suspicion, their voices into hushed accusations. Every cough was a precursor to the blight, every shadow a lurking demon, every misfortune a sign of divine displeasure or worse, human malice. In this cauldron of anxiety, Elias Thorne was a new, unknown ingredient, and his very existence seemed to curdle the communal brew. He sought lodging at the Twisted Vine, a ramshackle inn whose sagging timbers groaned under the weight of centuries of despair. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman named Alara with eyes like polished stones, regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her hands, gnarled and calloused, wiped down the scarred wooden counter, but her gaze never left him. A room. "Mistress?" Elias's voice was low, resonant, like a cello string plucked in a quiet hall. It held no trace of the local dialect, further marking him as an outsider. Alara hesitated, her lips thin. "We don't often see travelers this time of year, especially not ones who carry so little." Her eyes flickered to his satchel. Then, back to his face, searching for answers, he offered none. "Necessity dictates," he replied simply, placing a handful of silver coins on the counter. They glinted dully in the dim light of the inn, far more than a night's lodging cost. Alara's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Silver was scarce in Oakhaven. Where did a man with no apparent trade acquire such wealth? The question hung, unspoken in the air, a silent accusation. A burly figure emerged from the shadows by the hearth, drawn by the unusual sound of coin. Gregor, the town's self-appointed guardian of virtue, and a man whose bulk was matched only by his suspicion, lumbered forward. His face, scarred and grim, was perpetually contorted into a sneer. He was a veteran of forgotten skirmishes, a man who saw enemies in every stranger, and Elias Thorne, with his quiet intensity and foreign silver, was a prime candidate. "What? Business brings you to Oakhaven, stranger?" Gregor's voice was a low growl, a challenge. He leaned against a timber post, arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes, small and beady, dissecting Elias. Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Passage. I seek only respite from the road." Gregor scoffed. "Respite? This is no pilgrim's path nor a merchant's route. This is Oakhaven. We know our own. You are not one of us." Ilara, sensing the rising tension, cleared her throat. "Gregor, he is a paying guest. It is not your place." "It is every man's place to guard his home, Ilara," Gregor interrupted, his voice laced with menace. "Especially when the wolves begin to prowl." He spat on the floor, a deliberate act of disdain. Elias said nothing, his expression unreadable. He simply watched Gregor, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his jaw, the only hint of his internal state. It was this stillness, this lack of emotional reaction, that unsettled Gregor more than any defiance would have. It was unnatural, chilling. Reluctantly, Ilara led Elias to a small, damp room upstairs. The single window overlooked a narrow, refuse-strewn alley. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and stale straw. Elias did not complain. He merely placed his satchel on the rickety table, his gaze lingering on the worn leather as if it contained the entirety of his meager world. Days turned into a week, then two. Elias Thorne remained a phantom presence in Oakhaven. He ate his meals in silence at the inn, ventured out only when necessary, and spoke to no one unless directly addressed. He spent hours in his room, and sounds of scratching, like a quill, on parchment, or perhaps something more peculiar, occasionally drifted down to the common room below, fueling the whispers. Children, coached by their parents, pointed at him in the street, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Farmers, their harvests failing, grumbled that his very presence was an ill omen. The local priest, Father Cale, a man whose piety was matched only by his paranoia, watched him with a hawk's intensity from the pulpit during daily mass. One bitter morning, a child fell gravely ill. Young Anya, no more than 6 summers old, was seized by a fever that burned like an internal fire. Her small body convulsed, her breath came in ragged gasps, and the town's elderly healer, Master Theron, shook his head gravely, his remedies failing. Despair settled over the Ilara household like a shroud. The mother, frantic, desperate, remembered the stranger's quiet demeanor, the peculiar glint of intelligence in his eyes. In her grief, she clutched at a fragile straw of hope. Against the protests of her husband and the dire warnings of their neighbors, Ilara sought out Elias. She found him by the river, his back to the town, gazing at the turbulent, icy water. He held a small, smooth stone in his hand, turning it over and over, as if seeking answers within its ancient contours. "Sir." "Master Thorne," she stammered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "My Anya, she is dying. Master Theron says there is nothing more to be done. But I saw you once, tending to a wounded bird. You were gentle. You have a kindness about you, despite what others say. Please, I beg you, look at my child." Elias turned slowly. His eyes, in the harsh morning light, seemed to hold a flicker of something ancient and weary. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and saw not a frantic woman, but a mother drowning in sorrow. He knew the risk. To offer help, to display any unusual skill, was to invite scrutiny, to fan the flames of suspicion. But a child's life hung in the balance. He nodded, a single decisive movement. "Lead the way." They hurried back to Ilara's small cottage, the silence between them heavy with unspoken dread. Inside, Anya lay on a crude pallet, her skin unnaturally flushed, her lips blue. Elias knelt beside her, his movements fluid and unhurried. He did not ask for herbs or poultices. Instead, he reached into his satchel, extracting a small, intricately carved wooden box. From within, he took out a single, slender vial filled with a shimmering, opalescent liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the gloom. It was unlike anything Master Theron had ever seen. He uncorked the vial, a faint, sweet scent, like spring rain and distant forests, filling the room. He dipped a finger into the liquid and carefully touched it to Anya's lips. The child stirred, a low moan escaping her throat. Elias then placed his palm gently on her forehead. A peculiar warmth radiated from his hand, a sensation that surprised Ilara, even through the child's feverish skin. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air in the small room seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, an intensity that both fascinated and terrified Ilara. Hours passed. Elias remained by Anya's side, occasionally touching her, sometimes murmuring words in a language Ilara did not recognize. Gradually, miraculously, the fever began to recede. Anya's breathing eased, her skin lost its unnatural flush, and a faint flush of color returned to her cheeks. By evening, she slept, a deep, restorative slumber, her small hand clutching one. Of Elias's fingers, Ilara wept, tears of relief mingling with a profound, terrifying awe. You saved her," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You did what Master Theron could not. How did you do it?" Elias withdrew his hand, his face pale with exertion. He looked at the sleeping child, a hint of something akin to sorrow in his eyes. "It is an old way," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "A forgotten knowledge. Nothing more." The splintering crash of glass was a punctuation mark, a violent declaration that the fragile truce between Elias Thorne and the town of Oakhaven was irrevocably broken. Elias, still standing by the window, a single shard clinging to his threadbare cloak, did not flinch. His face, illuminated by the flickering, malevolent glow of the torches below, was a study in grim resignation. He had known this day might come, perhaps even expected it. His knowledge, his very existence, was a spark in a tinderbox of superstition and fear, and Oakhaven was a town perpetually on the verge of spontaneous combustion. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a fleeting image of a sun-drenched meadow long forgotten, flashing across his mind before the present horror reasserted its brutal grip. The guttural roar of the mob swelled, a collective beast hungry for blood. Footsteps thundered below, the rhythmic thudding against the inn's ancient floorboards, signaling a breach. The twisted vine, which had offered him fleeting sanctuary, now groaned under the weight of its attackers, its very timbers seeming to cry out in protest. Elias moved with a practiced fluidity, and regret, swift and sharp, pierced him. Not for saving the child, never for that, but for the blindness he had allowed to settle upon him, the naive hope that simple kindness could outweigh entrenched fear. He swept his precious satchel from the table, clutching it to his chest, its worn leather a familiar comfort against the chilling reality. Escape, he knew, was a phantom hope, a whisper in the wind. The inn was old, but its layout was predictable, its exits few. The mob would have them all covered. A heavy boot slammed against his door, once, twice, the ancient wood groaning, threatening to give way. The shouts grew louder, distinct words now discernible through the clamor. "Witch! Sorcerer! Heretic!" The very air vibrated with their hatred, a tangible, suffocating weight. Ilara's shrill shriek pierced the din, a sound of pure terror, followed by the crash of furniture. The mob was inside. He considered the window. A jump would mean a broken leg, perhaps worse, and a swift capture in the muddy alley below. No. That was a fool's gambit. His only recourse was to face them, to somehow navigate the storm, though hope withered in his breast like a frost-nipped blossom. He took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and burning pitch filling his nostrils. And then, with a quiet strength, he pulled open the creaking door. Gregor stood there, his massive frame filling the narrow hallway, a crude pitchfork clutched. In one hand, its prongs glinting ominously. Behind him, a knot of townsfolk, faces contorted with rage and fanaticism, jostled for position, their torches casting grotesque dancing shadows on the peeling plaster walls. Ilara was cowering behind Gregor, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her eyes, when they met Elias's, were not filled with gratitude, but with a terror so profound it eclipsed all else. The sight of it was a colder blow than any stone. She had brought him here, offered him a sliver of kindness, and now, in her abject fear, she stood by as the hounds she had inadvertently unleashed bayed for his blood. It was not a betrayal of malice, but of weakness, a far more insidious poison. "There he is! The devil's spawn!" Gregor bellowed, his voice thick with triumph. He raised the pitchfork, its tip pointing directly at Elias's chest. "Come! Out, sorcerer! Your time in Oakhaven is done!" Elias stepped into the hallway, his posture erect, his gaze unwavering. "I am no sorcerer, Gregor. I merely aided a sick child." His voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, a stark contrast to the animalistic frenzy surrounding him. This composure, rather than pacifying them, seemed to infuriate the mob further. It was the calmness of a predator, in their eyes, not a victim. "Silence, fiend!" Father Cale, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury, pushed. Through the crowd, a heavy wooden crucifix clutched in his hand. "Confess your unholy practices, confess your blasphemies, or face the wrath of God and his faithful flock." Elias looked at Father Cale, then at Gregor, then at the sea of terrified and enraged faces behind them. He saw no reason, no understanding, only the raw, visceral hunger for retribution. To argue was pointless, to resist, futile. He had seen this before in other towns, in other times, the cyclical dance of fear and accusation. "I have nothing to confess," Elias stated, his voice ringing with a quiet defiance. "I did only what was good," Gregor roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "Seize him! Bring him down!" The mob surged forward. Hands, crude and rough, tore at Elias's cloak, ripping the fabric, sending him stumbling back. The satchel was wrenched from his grasp, its contents spilling onto the dusty floor. A scattering of dried herbs, a small, smooth stone, a tarnished silver compass, and a handful of strange, undecipherable parchments, their edges browned with age. Maeve, the gossipy neighbor, shrieked as she saw the compass, declaring it a witch's tool designed to summon spirits. Father Cale's eyes narrowed on the parchments, his face paling slightly as if he recognized some ancient, forbidden script. Elias was dragged from his room, down the creaking stairs, and into the common room of the Twisted Vine, which was now a maelstrom of humanity. Chairs were overturned, tables shoved aside, ale slopped across the floor, all in the mad scramble to get a glimpse of the condemned. Ilara, huddled behind the bar, watched through splayed fingers, her breath catching in her throat. Her child lived because of him, yet fear rooted her to the spot. The betrayal, though born of terror, was complete. Outside, the cold morning air assaulted Elias's face, sharp and biting. He was pulled into the street, the slick mud squelching under his bare feet. His boots had been torn off in the struggle. The crowd parted just enough for him to be seen, a gauntlet of angry faces and raised fists. Shouts of "Burn him!" and "To the stake!" echoed through the narrow lane, bouncing off the grim stone walls of the houses. Small children, lifted onto their father's shoulders, pointed with innocent cruelty. their young voices mimicking the hatred of their elders. A stone, thrown with unexpected force, glanced off his temple, sending a searing pain through his skull and a trickle of warm blood down his cheek, mingling with the rain. He tasted iron. He was shoved, pulled, and kicked through the winding streets of Oakhaven, past the butcher's shop with its gruesome display of hanging carcasses, past the baker's, where the usual comforting smell of fresh bread was replaced by the acrid stench of mob fury. Every jolt, every shove, every epithet hurled at him, chipped away at his composure, but he refused to scream. He refused to beg. His silence seemed to infuriate them further, confirming their belief in his inhumanity. Finally, they reached the town square, a bleak open space dominated by a weathered wooden gallows, rarely used, but a permanent reminder of Oakhaven's grim justice. A makeshift platform had been erected beneath it, fashioned from overturned carts and splintered planks. Father Kyle clambered onto it, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the leaden sky, his crucifix raised high like a weapon. Gregor, still clutching his pitchfork, dragged Elias to the center of the square and roughly shoved him onto his knees. "In the mud before the platform! Behold!" Father Cale's voice boomed, amplified by the raw open space. "Behold the instrument of the devil who sought to corrupt our blessed town with his dark practices!" He gestured wildly towards Elias. "He speaks in tongues, he carries unholy artifacts, and by his foul magic he cured a child where God's own servants failed. This is not divine intervention, my flock, but a pact with the infernal. He is a sorcerer, a witch, a plague sent to test our faith." A collective gasp, then a renewed roar of agreement swept through the crowd. Elias, his head bowed, felt the cold mud seep through his breeches, numbing his knees. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, searching for any glimmer of doubt, any flicker of recognition, but found none. Only hatred, fear, and a terrifying, unified delusion. Gregor stepped forward, picking up the scattered contents of Elias's satchel. He held up the tarnished silver compass. "Look at this devil's toy. It moves without touch. It points to unseen places." He shook the parchments. "And these, words not of God, but of shadow and damnation." His eyes, however, lingered for a moment on one particular parchment, a swift, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between him and Father Cale. It was a fragment of a map, ancient and faded, depicting a series of symbols and cryptic markings, seemingly innocuous to the common eye, but hinting at something more significant to those who knew what to look for. "Confess, demon!" Father Cale shrieked, his voice hoarse. "Confess your sins, and perhaps God's mercy through our swift judgment may yet save your soul from eternal damnation." Elias slowly raised his head, his eyes dark and resolute, meeting Father Cale's gaze. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through his frame. "I have nothing to confess," he repeated, his voice low but clear, carrying across the square. "I am a man of knowledge, not of evil. You condemn me out of ignorance and fear." His defiance, though quiet, was like oil poured on the raging fire. Gregor, infuriated, backhanded him across the face, sending his head snapping to the side. The taste of blood filled his mouth. "Impudent dog!" Gregor spat. "He denies his master!" Father Cale raised his crucifix higher, his voice trembling with a mixture of zeal and barely suppressed triumph.